currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is August 30th, 2013. Tonight, I am going to be airing, uninterrupted, my full interview with Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. You all know who she is. She's the author / whistleblower who wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Her websites, deliberatedumbingdown.com, americandeception.com. Go check them both out. Purchase her book. Tonight she's going to be getting into Skull and Bones. I thought it appropriate with all of the warmongering being perpetrated by Mr. Bonesman John Kerry. I thought it would be appropriate to get into Skull and Bones tonight. So, sit back, relax a little bit, put your feet up. You're going to get a chance to hear Charlotte talk about Skull and Bones, not so much the craziness, weird ceremonies that go on. She does give you the books, however, to go research that stuff. But she gets into how the order is connected to everything from education to banking to politics, industry. She gives you a brief nutshell history of it in about an hour and 40 minutes. But believe me when I say that there is much more research to be doing on it. And you can always go purchase a copy of some of the books that she's going to be referencing tonight over at Trine Day, TrineDay.com, Trine Day Publishing, Chris Milligan. You'll hear her mention Chris during the interview. I urge you to go research everything that she talks about tonight. This vast conspiracy, the vast conspiracy that even Kennedy mentioned, is so big that you cannot learn about it in an hour and expect to be a expert or even know on a base level of what's going on. So make sure you do your research. This stuff is not conspiracy theory. It's not tinfoil hattery. It's conspiracy fact. It's time people understood that. So here we go. Without further ado, Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt on Skull and Bones. Tonight, I'm going to be interviewing again, for your listening pleasure, a good friend of mine and a lady responsible for the awakening of millions of people around the world to what is going on. My good friend, Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. And tonight we're going to be going over Skull and Bones. We're going to be getting into the order
like no one else has. And Charlotte is the best person that I could think of to get into the order because her father and her grandfather were bonesmen, and she has a bit of an insider's understanding that none of us could ever have. So, without further ado, let me bring up my guest for this evening, Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt. Charlotte, welcome back to the broadcast.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Popeye, for having me on. And it's always a pleasure. The last interview was really wonderful, and I had so many comments on it. And you're special. You know, I do think that has a lot to do. And you're a great interviewer. If that's the right word. I always feel so comfortable when I do interviews with you. But this particular interview in regard to the order at Yale, the Order of America's Secret Establishment, the Order of Skull and Bones, is of interest to me for the very reason, we'll go into a little more of that later, that it's mostly of interest to me because the order has been really basically, I would say, the number one instrument in not only affecting our foreign policy, our economy, and our education system, but with the latter, our education system. The order brought in a Sikh philosophy out of Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, late 1800s, which Pavlov also studied there. After 10 years after Wundt's lab was set up, it brought in this worldview that is totally all around us now and contrary to anything any human beings really were educated in, certainly in the Western world up until very recently, and that is that man is an animal and to be conditioned, and it works very well, to do what the state, the good of the state, right? For the good of the state. And the founders of the order, you can trace it back to the Illuminati in Germany and Wilhelm Wundt and his grandfather, who was a member of the order. It's based on the philosophy of do what thou wilt. Do your own thing. You know, this is the do your own thing mentality that we've been looking at since the 50s, certainly. The Humanist Manifesto, the original one was signed by many of these very people we're talking about, you know, Dewey, Skinner, etc., basically said there are no absolutes. We are looking today at the result of certainly 40, let's say, since the early part of the last century, but mainly since 1945, when the United Nations was formed. We're now looking at the results of this kind of education, and not just education, but how, well, of course it starts in the schools, but use of promulgation of this Sikh philosophy, do your own thing, man is an animal, no right, no wrong, do what thou wilt. And that's why we have so many problems with our young people now, and with cults, and with the music industry. It's just so tragic. And Hollywood, and many of your listeners, I know you've done a great job on that, Popeye. You look around and you see these symbols that are absolutely Masonic, Illuminati. They are Skull and Bones. I mean, Skull and Bones, the order at Yale, honestly, you'd think that they could have chosen a less offensive title, Skull and Bones, for what is considered to be the premier order. The only reason you could say that is the very, very, very secret order, fraternity in this country. It's more secret than any of the other fraternities in any of the other universities or colleges. So what it all boils down to is good and evil. And so we're going to talk about that today. And I apologize for the fact that my father and grandfather were members of this notorious order. My father had very little to do, as most of your listeners probably know. It's a very small percentage, maybe 15% of members of the order, that number 15 of them in the class too, that are selected in the junior year, maybe 15 will go on to be involved in world affairs, and by that I mean education, banking, industry, Wall Street, of course, banking and all, government, that would be different government agencies, the White House, of course, we have had two presidents, three now because it's two Bushes, and Taft way back, those are three presidents. Taft was one of the original founders of the order, very, very important. Gilman, Daniel Coit Gilman, in the beginning of the last century, he was a member of the order at Yale, and he also was made president of Johns Hopkins University. And he was the one that brought in G. Stanley Hall, an American who had studied under Wilhelm Wundt, a member of Skull and Bones at Yale, Daniel Coit Gilman, who also, interesting enough, was the first president of the Carnegie Corporation. Carnegie is very important here because right now we're putting in the Carnegie Plan that I've discussed in the past with you, 1934, the little book Conclusions and Recommendations for the Social Studies, which is at my son's website, American Deception, and people can go there and type in the word conclusions, and they'll get that little book that calls back in 1934 for using the schools to change America to a planned economy. And that, of course, would require the Skinner method and the Soviet Polytech system, and that is going in right now, and with school to work, with school choice, charter schools, with public-private partnerships, all of that. So it's very important to understand the role of the order. G. Stanley Hall was the leading educator who was educated under Wundt in Germany in the late 1800s, and he brought the method back. He was not a member of the order. However, the president of Johns Hopkins, the one I've just been talking about, Daniel Coit Gilman, was a member of Skull and Bones, and he is the one, as also first president of Carnegie, who brought G. Stanley Hall on board at Hopkins. Then Hall educated John Dewey, who most of your listeners know about, the most notorious humanist, atheist educator that took over our whole education system, and it was all Skinner. And then Thorndike, and then also another student of Wilhelm Wundt was brought on board, Russell, another Russell, not the Russell family of the order. But what I'm trying to point out here is that the influence of the order, they've been very involved in starting the American Historical Association, the American Economic Association, the American Chemical Society, and the American Psychological Association. All of these groups were started by members of the order or persons close to who were directed by the order. All right? Anthony Sutton, the late Anthony Sutton, prior to his becoming deeply involved in education, which actually was due to me, I'll go into that later. But prior to that, Sutton focused on United States aid, and this was the banks and the corporations and all American corporations, aid to the Soviet Union and to Hitler. And he wrote several books on that. And I want to point out right now that for people that want to follow up on this very interesting research, they can do so. You can buy the books, too, which I hope you will do, because the people who are publishing them are marvelous people who knew Sutton. You can buy America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. I believe that book is at my son's website, American Deception. And if that isn't the book that is How the Order Controls Education. I believe that is the book that is at American Deception. Very, very important. That was part of Sutton's study. Now, the other books are None Dare Call It Conspiracy by Gary Allen. That's a terribly important book to read to understand the role of Wall Street. Allen doesn't go into the order at Yale, but he goes into all the connections between Wall Street and the funding of of the Soviets and Hitler and the connections there, the corporations. And the other book that I'm going to be reading from is an extraordinary book by a friend of mine, Chris Milligan, whose father was with intelligence and CIA. And Chris had a lot of problems. When he found out from Anthony Sutton about the order, he made connections with his father's work, etc. And he wrote a great book called Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. And this is the book that carries the chapter by yours truly, Charlotte. It's called, the little chapter here is, What a Role Model for His Daughter. Well, that was in a positive sense I was speaking. My father was a wonderful role model for me. And so my little chapter is in here, but the rest of it is just extraordinary. I'm just going to read the table of contents here. Now, I want all your listeners to know that, you can read this book on the Internet. So if Charlotte leaves anything out today, or if you want to check up on Charlotte's words to make sure I know what I'm talking about, you can check up that way too. And maybe you're going to find out I'm wrong on something, which I really would like to be. Wouldn't we all like to be wrong? Okay, this is taken from Chris Milligan's great, this is a real tome. Sutton's book, America's Secret Establishment, on the order, he dealt a tremendous amount on education. And then he'd written all of his other books on technology. But I love The Secret Establishment because he dealt so much on education. But this one, this is called Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, Investigations into America's Most Powerful Secret Society. And the chapters are Everything You Wanted to Know, to Ask But Were Afraid to Know, the September 11th Attack, the War on Terror, and the Order of Skull and Bones. What a Role Model for His Daughters. That's Charlotte. Geronimo's Bones, Prescott Bush, 1.5 million, and Auschwitz. Reflections on the Yale Succession. Secrecy and Our Constitution. Whom do they serve? Memoir concerning events at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, because that's where Sutton worked, and he did remarkable work. I think when he got onto the list that little Charlotte gave him, he was not popular any longer, right? Because he had the goods on him. Black Market Bones, the War of 82, the Secret Treaty of Fort Hunt, Mind Control, the Illuminati, and the JFK assassination. Prescott Bush, the Union Banking Corporation, and the story, Who Financed Adolf Hitler, Antithesis, Financing the Nazis, the House of Bush, Born in a Bank, the Hitler Project, Race Hygiene, 3 Bush family alliances. The center of power is in Washington. Skull and Bones, the racist nightmare at Yale. The Order of Skull and Bones and Illegal Finance, a study of the analytical framework of conspiracy theory. The Tomb, God and Man and Magic at Yale. Oh, and let me make a point here. William Buckley, with his National Review, he was a member of the Order at Yale. And the Order really served as a conduit. Really, it was a CIA operation. So that, good conservatives were really betrayed by William Buckley. You should read the book by John McManus on William Buckley. It's called something about the establishment, William Buckley. You could look for that on the Internet. Be sure to read that book. I'm not often absolutely astounded by the depth of biographical information on a person like William Buckley. But I'll tell you, this is dynamite because it's not just William Buckley. You're going to see a lot of people, conservatives associated with William Buckley, that you thought were good and aren't. And you're going to find out that National Review was never what we'd been told it was all about. And I think this is exactly what Chris is talking about here. God and Man and Magic at Yale. God and Man at Yale was a book written by William Buckley. All right, Pictures from the Crypt. The Deer Island Club. That's where they would go. And my father, it's interesting. I think Dad really got pretty fed up with the Order early on, because I don't ever remember him going to Deer Island. He did go to the Bohemian Grove once because he was invited by a big hotshot in the Order at Yale. It was a very close friend of his. He was invited out to Bohemian Grove, and he said he'd never go back. He said it was very interesting. the lectures and all, and the food was excellent, and the entertainment was good, but he would never go back. So, but Deer Island, I really don't ever remember my father going out to any of those retreats. Now, historical articles, Secret Societies at Yale, Harper's Weekly, The Fall of Skull and Bones, The Tomb Graffiti Trial of 1878, The Founding of Wolf's Head, Undergraduate Days, Yale College, 1906, Yale University, the Social System in the College, Encyclopedia of Fraternities, Secret Societies at Yale, Yale Appendices, and Bibliography. And this is really an extraordinary book that a friend of mine who's a retired public school teacher, and she and I formed Guardians of Education for Maine in the 80s, late 70s. And she's brilliant and a fine writer herself, a really good editor. And I was really surprised. This is a long book, and I can't say that I've read every single word of it by any means, but it's about 600 pages. It has wonderful pictures and everything. And she read it, and she said, that is the most comprehensive history I've ever read. And I thought that was a huge compliment coming from her, knowing her. And so I highly recommend that you get this book and go. It is at my son's website, AmericanDeception.com. Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, Investigations into America's Most Powerful Secret Society. It has Sutton, Milligan, Altman, Bunch, Chetkin, and Webster Griffin Tarpley, and Charlotte. My name's not on the cover, but that's just fine. Now, what I'm going to do here I'm going to read to you from the book cover, from both books. I'm doing a lot of reading this way, but I do think it's important because this is how you get your facts, and you can forward the stuff, when Popeye gets it on the internet, forward it around. This is the cover to Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, the inside of the cover, and here we go. This is Chris Milligan talking. This is the author, who is a close friend of Anthony Sutton's. I also met Chris out in California prior to Anthony Sutton's unfortunate passing away. Quote, these secret societies are behind it all, end quote. My father told me many years ago. During the early 50s, he was a CIA branch chief, head of the East Asia Intelligence Analysis Office. Quote, the Vietnam War, end quote, he said soberly, quote, is about drugs, end quote. Many years later, I finally had some understanding of what Dad was talking about. I wish I had asked more questions, such as, was he talking about the Order of Skull and Bones? Of course, the drug trade, Yale, the order at Yale, Russell, the founder of the order in 1832, his family was very involved in China, and Yale was involved in China in the drug trade and opium, etc., and has always been involved one way or the other with drugs, but bringing them in, illegal drug pushing, opium, this, that, and all, and then they'll be involved in legislating against drugs, which of course creates the problem. And that on both sides, they take both sides, they always end up winning. It's a dialectic again. So it's another thing to remember about the order is its role in the whole problem of tragic problem in our country of drugs. And of course, the Vietnam War, the men who did get back, the ones that got back, so many of them had, through no fault of their own, really become involved in that. So anyway, we go on here, this book cover. It says, it's a symbol used, this is the Skull and Bones 322, it's a symbol used by pirates, poisoners, and the Nazis. But it's also a fraternity at Yale University. College kids having fun? Well, 15 juniors are tapped each year. Around 2,500 Yale graduates have been members, mostly white males from wealthy northeastern families. And now take note, folks. Very important, these names. Bush, we know about the Bushes, okay? Well, maybe not, but once you read this book, you will. Bundy, the Bundys, are very important as far as Charlotte's concerned, because he was the head of the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation was very involved, as is Carnegie, right? Carnegie and Ford, very deeply involved in changing education. And he, Bundy, and later on, Harold Howe, Skull and Bones, was appointed Commissioner of Education, the U.S. Office of Education. That was before we had the department. He was appointed in the early 60s, Commissioner. And it was he who was deeply involved in the integration of the schools. Harold Howe was deeply involved. Skull and Bones, Harold Howe, you could look him up on the Internet. And his comments were something like, he wanted to see the suburban white areas with their neatly mown grass or whatever, and their country clubs and everything just explode, and to integrate everything. And he was a radical out of Skull and Bones. Very, very important. Because the integration, as much as I would really like to say that it had helped the blacks and the minorities with my research on education, they were used. The integration movement was an excuse to use them to experiment with the Skinner method. And I have an interesting article I wrote. I think it's interesting. Well, maybe you won't. I don't know. But it's at my website, deliberatdumbingdown.com, and it's a PDF, and it's called Experimentation on Minorities. What they did is they went in, they used the inner city schools, the minorities, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, California, whatever, all over, Boston, the inner city schools, to change our traditional education system with its hierarchical structure of competition, K through 12, and grades for competition, A, B, C, D, right? They had to change that system. They knew they couldn't get away with it. But don't forget Harold Howe, here, Skull and Bones, huh? They knew they could never get away with changing that system in the white communities, or the more affluent communities, taking away the 4 years of math, science, etc. So that's all being taken away now, folks, right? So they used the inner city schools to experiment with the destruction of our traditional hierarchical system with elected school boards, 3 principals, elementary school, middle, superintendent. Sometimes they were even elected superintendents. Elected school board, competition, A, B, C, D, F. I got some Fs. Some of the listeners probably do. That was a wonderful system, but that would not work for the system they wanted to put in, which Carnegie, which I just said how important Carnegie was with Skull and Bones, too. Daniel Coit Gilman was the first president of Carnegie. Daniel Coit Gilman, who brought back the number one student and appointed him to teach psychology and the Skinner method, brought G. Stanley Hall back and installed him at Johns Hopkins. So the order brought back G. Stanley Hall to install him at Hopkins. And that was the beginning of the pushing of the Skinner method. The man is an animal to be trained, not to be educated. So we'll go back there. So then we end up with deciding, you've got this Skull and Bones guy, Harold Howe, being put in under Lyndon Johnson to bring about the integration in the schools, school busing and all that. And what they did, they used those schools, and my article is called Experimentation on Minorities. It's at deliberatdumbingdown.com, a PDF. They used those schools, those minority schools, to change, to work out all the kinks in getting rid of grades, competition, math, science, blah, 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 and putting in training, pigeon training. I could make a pigeon a high achiever by reinforcing it on a proper schedule. That's right out of the mouth of B.F. Skinner, okay? So, I hope you understand. They used the minorities. They couldn't have done this without integration, I don't think. This is when they moved towards performance-based education, too, 1965. And this was all, Harold Howe deeply involved. You may wonder why I'm going, I didn't know this until last year. All of a sudden, I got some little research in mind. I was looking at it, and I thought, ooh, he was a bad guy. Harold Howe. I was reading something out of the National Educator in Washington, in California, a marvelous little journal way back in the 70s. And I was reading about Harold Howe and talking about the neatly mowed grass, in the white communities and all, how we had to, blow up the whole structure there, that culture. And I thought, wow, he's a nasty one. I'd forgotten. I thought, you know what? I'm going to look in my little black books and see those little black books that I gave to Anthony Sutton, that on the Big Bad Charlotte. She broke their secrecy about their members by giving those 3 little black books to Anthony Sutton, and he published them. Right? He was thrilled. He was thrilled to get those 3 little black books.
I wonder if they still publish those type of books anymore because of the fact that you were able to do that.
Oh, they don't. So anyway, lo and behold, I find Harold Howe. He was a very, very important, and his whole biography is listed there, all the different schools he taught at, blah, 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 blah. So that was a huge find for me, because it clicked with my observation, or whatever you want to call it, my research on how they used they've used the blacks before too, and other minorities. Huh? So anyway, we're going to go on here. So we have the 15 juniors, Bush family, Bundy. You see, I went flying off because of Bundy, who was the president of the Ford Foundation, and then we got into my discussion of Harold Howe, who was very close to him. So it was there were two very important. I mean, I have something. The Cardinal Principles for the National Education Association in 1976. Their new Cardinal Principles. Fascinating document for the NEA. It's about global education. And I looked at the back. This is interesting. We got a hold of that NEA document. And we called the NEA because we had a horrible one of those ditto sheet type things, purple. I could hardly read it. But we were able to, decipher it. But the NEA said, oh, no, we never had such an article. Oh, yes, they did. The NEA's Cardinal Principles. Well, the reason I'm talking about that is that the pre-planning committee for the NEA, everybody thinks it's just the NEA hates corporations, hates the Rockefellers, hates the Carnegies. Oh, no. The pre-planning committee had David Rockefeller on it and George Bundy, the order. And then all these educators, Theodore Sizer, Goodlad, Ted Bell, all of them. Very important, that pre-planning committee. That's in my book. I believe it's in the Deliberate Dumbing Down, the free download. You can look under that, under NEA Cardinal Principles. So you see that they're in bed together. So we were talking about Bundy working with the NEA. That's Skull and Bones working with the NEA. Cheney, that's not Dick Cheney. I don't know which Cheney that is. Dodge, Ford, Goodyear, Harriman, of course, Harriman, banking, big time. Heinz, that's Heinz, I would imagine. Isn't that John Kerry's wife's family? Or I think it is.
Yep, Teresa Heinz
Kellogg,
Kerry.
Yeah, Phelps, Pillsbury, the flour company. My dad knew I hate to tell you, my dad knew quite a few of these people. Rockefeller, Taft, very important. Taft was one of the founders of the order. Vanderbilt, Weyerhaeuser, and Whitney are some of the names on its roster. Minorities were brought into membership in the 50s, and the first women were admitted in 1991. Now, I'm just going to go off track a little bit here. The first women were admitted. Now, when Anthony Sutton's book was about to be published, I can't remember because there were 2 dates on it, but anyway, whenever that was, 1983, I think. Yeah. Yes, that would have been when I talked to him. The order got very upset, because they were going to be exposed. So they got, what's her name? Robbins. I think her name is Robbins, something over Robbins, to write a book on the order because she was one of the first women to be, taken into the order. People can look her up, just Robbins, I'm sure that's correct. She wrote about everything. This is what's interesting. They will let out, because I guess they have to, because it's out now, all the information about USA to the Soviet Union, building the Kama River truck factory, right, which allowed the Soviets to have all the trucks to move into Afghanistan. And the agreement, Hitler supplying, and all the money going over from the bank to Hitler, and actually, the Federal Reserve, of course, the original money going into the Russian Revolution was William Boyce Thompson, the first head of the Federal Reserve. And he gave $1 million, right? So they allow all of this out. Now, well, they have to because it's out, huh? But they do not want anybody to understand the importance of the order, what I'm talking about today and what Charlotte talks about constantly. Bringing the Skinnerian, Pavlovian, animal training, man as an animal method, bringing that from Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig. They don't want that information out. They don't want anybody to know their role in changing American education from strong academics. We had a great education system. Don't let anybody ever tell you we didn't. We had a great education system up until 1980, really, when they told us it was rotten, and they implemented a nation at risk to get us all terrified because a tide of mediocrity. Well, Admiral commissioned the Sandia, the Sandia people to do a study on those results that that Ted Bell, my old office, was using. That was my office, a nation at risk, and found out that the results, the statistics were not, they were really pretty skewed, huh? So what we're finding out is that the method, they started trying to get it in way back, early 1900s. It came over in the late 1800s, thanks to Skull and Bones and the direct connection with the Illuminati and no right, no wrong. And you can understand no right, no wrong. Well, animals don't really understand right and wrong either, do they? So our children are to be trained in what they want. They, at the order, it's very evil. We got to Whitney, and then it says the minorities were brought into membership in the 50s. Okay, and the first women were admitted. All right, so Robbins, who's one of the first, this woman, she writes a book, and she gets it published by one of the major publishers, right? We don't. We have to have our own little publishing companies. Oh, I think it was Random House, or I don't know what, one of them. And you know what she doesn't mention? She doesn't mention the order's role in education. And that is how it is supposed to be, because education is the key to the future, whether a country is going to be successful or die. And we're dying now, and our children are in the process dying because of the sick philosophy that was brought over. This is from Sutton. This is from his book, The Beginning America's Secret Establishment, An Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. Anthony Sutton was a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, from 1968 to 1973. He is a former economics professor at California State University, L.A. He was born in London in 1925 and educated at the Universities of London, Göttingen, and California with a Doctor of Science degree from the University of Southampton, England. His books are, I want you to remember that they have done everything possible to bury Anthony Sutton, his name, his books, his articles, everything. And he did die, I think, prematurely, in quotes. Okay. The books by the author. Technological Treason, The Diamond Connection, Gold versus Paper, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. The reason I'm reading these, folks, is so that you'll have a list, and you can go and buy some of these books if you want on the internet. The War on Gold, Energy, The Created Crisis, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wars and Revolutions, Parts 1 and 2, Wall Street and Franklin D. Roosevelt, Trilaterals over Washington, Volume 1 and Volume 2. These are the big babies. Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. I think these are the ones that were worked on for Hoover. 1917 to 1930. Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1930 to 1945. Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1945 to 1965. National Suicide, Military Aid of the Soviet Union in 1973. That was quite a book. I did read that one. Introduction to the Order, How the Order Controls Education, How the Order Creates War and Revolution, The Secret Cult of the Order, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. He has this little quote here. This is from an anonymous Yale student in 1873 in regard to the order. We offer no objections to their existing plan. No one disputes with them this right. We question but the plan on which they act, dash, that only he who wears upon his breast their emblem, he, for every post, shall be considered best. Okay, so that means every post from the White House down to NATO, to being Commissioner of Education, to being the president of the largest bank, the president of the most important foundations, and you can go on and on and on. And probably the top publishing companies like Henry Luce, Time Magazine, and all those people. The media, terribly, terribly important. So these are the very important positions in all these different areas which I mentioned, but I was just talking about the media is so important, and that would be Henry Luce's family, Time Magazine, and Verner Cowell's Look, and you can go on. And William Buckley, National Review, that kept all the conservatives intact. That's sort of an interesting one because Buckley, I always thought it was interesting how he got along with Henry Kissinger. And so Henry Kissinger really needed National Review because whenever he'd do something atrocious in the eyes of a real American, like agreement with getting China into the UN or whatever, or the Vietnam War, he would have Buckley's National Review to sort of defend him. Well, and anyway, so the media, I think all of you know how important the media is. But we don't have any freedom of the press anymore, do we? Zero. It's gone. We don't call ourselves press. What are we? We have our own form of the press, right? All right. And Popeye, you're one of them. Media. All right. Now, we have all of these. We have all of the different. I'm not going to go through all of this. How the order relates to the CFR and the trilaterals, the Bundy operation, keeping the lid on the pot. These are different little table of contents. Is there a conspiracy explanation for recent history? The order, what it is and how it began, how much is known about the order, who is in the secret society, what organizations has it penetrated, operations of the order, how the order relates to the CFR and trilaterals, the chain of influence, how it works, the Bundy operation, huh? No, I was just talking about that too. Keeping the lid on the pot, how the order controls education, Memo 1, and these are all memos all the way through Memo 9. 1, it all began at Yale. 2, the Look-Say reading scam. 3, the Illuminati connection. 4, the Leipzig connection. Oh, and I do want to give credit right now to Paolo Leone for the most extraordinary small book, and I mean small. It is only 95 pages, and it's a tiny paperback too, huh? And it's called The Leipzig Connection. And if there is ever a book you have to get, because Charlotte's main interest is in the fact that our children aren't animals and they should not be trained as animals, and the training of animals comes out of Leipzig and Skull and Bones. So anyway, this book, The Leipzig Connection, is terribly important. You can get it on the internet. Anthony Sutton and I we use research in here. It's the history of how American education was changed from what you know in your head to performance-based, what you could do using upward conditioning, stimulus response. And if you want to know what that means, basically, it's when you go to the doctor and he checks your neurological reactions, he'll take a hammer and hit your knee, and it'll pop up. That's an automatic reaction. That is not learning. That is a reflex reaction. That is what operant conditioning is all about. And it is excellent for brainwashing, obviously, because you have no control. So anyway, life's the connection, terribly important, and Sutton gives credit here for that. The Troika spreads its wings. The orders, objective for education, summary, conclusions and recommendations. How the order creates war and revolution. Memorandum number 1, created conflict and the dialectic process. Now, we are seeing that. Ever since we went into Iraq in 1990, haven't we seen enough of this? Create the problem, people scream and pose the solution. But you're the one who frames the problem and frames the solution. And the poor people are just stuck in there, victimized. Memorandum number 2, operational vehicles for conflict creation. Memorandum 3, thesis. The order creates the Soviet Union. You had to do that, didn't you? But number 4, antithesis. The thesis is they created the Soviet Union. The antithesis is they financed the Nazis. Right? And Angola and China, the new dialectic. Then we have the secret cult of the order, introduction to the cult, organization of the order, ritual of the order, satanic aspects of the order. Is the order also Illuminati? Anonymous, Skull and Bones, the fall of Skull and Bones, etc. Secret societies. Now, I'm going to get into, I'm going to read from the author's preface, and this is Sutton in 1983, Phoenix, Arizona. After 16 books and 25 years in basic research, I thought I'd heard it all. The world was a confused mess, probably beyond understanding, and certainly beyond salvation. And there was little I could do about it. Back in 1968, my Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development was published by the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. In 3 substantial volumes, I detailed how the West had built the Soviet Union. However, the work generated a seemingly insoluble puzzle. Why, in big black bold, have we done this? Why, again in bold, did we build the Soviet Union? Well, we also transferred the technology to Hitler's Germany. Again, why does Washington want to conceal these facts? Why have we boosted Soviet military power and simultaneously boosted our own? In subsequent books, the Wall Street series, I added more questions, but no answers. I had more or less arrived at the conclusion that there was no rational answer that could be proven. And this is in 1983. Then a year or so ago, I received an 8-inch batch of documents, nothing less than the membership list of an American secret society. And that's what little Charlotte gave Sutton, right? I think I wrote him and said I had them, and he was very happy to get them. Glancing through the sheets, it was more than obvious this was no ordinary group. The names spelled power with a big P. As I probed each individual, a pattern emerged, and a formerly fuzzy world became crystal clear. The book you will read here is a combined version of a series reporting on this research. Each volume builds on the previous volume in a logical step-by-step process. These volumes will explain again why the West built the Soviets and Hitler, why we go to war to lose, why Wall Street loves Marxists and Nazis, why the kids can't read, why the churches have become propaganda founts. Well, that's another story, isn't it? Why historical facts are suppressed, Why Politicians Lie, and 100 other whys. This series is infinitely more important than the original Western technology series on technological transfers. If I have a magnum opus, this is it. Anthony C. Sutton, Phoenix, Arizona, July 30th, 1983. America's Secret Establishment has had an unusual publishing history. The book began with an anonymous donation to the author of an 8-inch package of documents in the early 1980s. Nothing less than the membership list and supporting documents for a truly secret society, the Yale Skull and Bones. The late Johnny Johnson of Phoenix, Arizona, was the spark that moved me to write first a 4-part series and later a jumbo volume based on this material. Interesting, this what he says. This volume went to several editions with several publishers, even a Russian edition of 12,000 copies. Probably in the past few years, as many copies have been sold in Russia as in the United States. Let me point something out here. It's interesting. You know, with my book, the updated version of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, I sold it at Amazon. You know, so I can see who's buying it, and I can see their names because I can check with Amazon. And I would say 90% of the people buying The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, the updated abridged version, because the other one's out of print. It's a free download, but it is out of print. But the people buying it are all from Eastern Europe and Russia. They have all those names with SKI on the end of it, sort of, you know what I mean? And, you know, so these are Americans who escaped communism. I mean, that's what I believe. Why would they be so interested in my book, huh? And yet, there are very few names of people buying my book, like my own name, Thompson or Jones or Smith or you know, Anglo-Saxon names. The people who found it, who came over to this country early on, we're spoiled rotten. You know, we don't even know what it's like to live under a dictatorship like communism or Nazi fascism, Nazism. We don't know. We don't know what that system's all about because we have not lived under it. Well, the people buying my book are the ones who got out and came to this great country, and you know, which has provided more freedom, more jobs, more economic and political and religious opportunity than any other country in the world, which is now being destroyed, you know, by Marxism. What's going in now in the United States, Marxism. And so they were really, because they feel uncomfortable, and they've heard me probably on radio, and they, you know, or read some of my stuff, and they say, oh, you know, she's pointing out what we're worried about around the dinner table. We're wondering, why is there no competition in the school anymore? What are they doing there, you know, teaching no right, no wrong? Well, you know, this looks like what we had at home, the old country. All right. So, as Sutton says, his book, this one on education and on aid to the Soviets, sold this volume, even was republished in Russian at 12,000 copies. America's Secret Establishment has had little publicity, few reviews, ignored by mainline distributors, yet has sold steadily for the past 16 years at a rate of several hundred copies a month. That's just great, isn't it? This activity, in turn, has generated other articles and books by other authors. But my real intent, to generate an exploration of Hegelian influence, oh, thank you, Anthony Sutton. Hegelian, no right, no wrong, Skinner influence in modern education has not been fulfilled, his real intent. In great part, this can be attributed to an educational system based on a statist Hegelian philosophy and which has already achieved the dumbing down of America. This disastrous, destructive philosophy, the source of both Nazism and Marxism, has infected and corrupted our constitutional republic. Much of the blame for this corruption is with an elitist group of Yale bonesmen. Their symbol of skull and bones and their Hegelian philosophy says it all. Although with typical duplicity, they would have you believe otherwise. Hegelianism glorifies the state. the vehicle for the dissemination of statist and materialist ideas and policies in education, science, politics, and economics. Wonder why we have a dumbed-down, in quotes, society? Look no further than the Bonesman Troika, who imported the Prussian education system into the United States in the 19th century. A political philosophy in direct opposition to the classical liberalism nurtured in 19th century British and American history. In classical liberalism, the state is always subordinate to the individual. In Hegelian statism, as we see in Nazism and Marxism, the state is supreme. And the individual exists only to serve the state. And a little aside from me there, that's what's happening now with the school to work, the merger of the public-private sector, which is really the Soviet system, industry, and government combined. Our children will have absolutely no upward mobility, no right to decide what they want to do, because there'll be a quota system for the number of jobs that are required in, say, at the local shipyard, the number of welders that they need. Say they only need 5. Your son always wanted to be a welder. He's number 7. He can't be. As Professor Boyce from Georgia University down there, no conservative, said in his book on communist education, quote, they do not educate for jobs that don't exist. So the good of your children, the good of the people under this Hegelian system of statism, forget it. Because the individual exists only to serve the state. And don't forget, this is going in through school choice and charter schools. They could not have put the system in with the old system of education. They had to have the charter schools, which are actually experimented on with minorities. I talked about that earlier. The charter schools are completely different. No grades, individual education plans, no competition, etc. So the old system, the old structure that we had that gave us the greatest education system in the world up until the 60s had to be jettisoned. And they used the blacks over a period of 50 years, certainly, experimenting with them. And no wonder their test scores were down, because they weren't doing academics. There was no competition. They were doing individual education plans. They were restructuring the whole thing. So anyway, so what we're talking about is the individual exists only to serve. Well, in that case, it was the blacks. They existed only to serve the state in putting in the new system of education. Now, our two-party Republican-Democrat, we get interested. This is interesting here because I think he gets into Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, probably. One Hegelian party. It equals one Hegelian party. No one else welcome or allowed. That two-party Republican-Democrat system is a reflection of this Hegelianism. A small group, very small group, by using Hegel, can manipulate and to some extent control society for its own purposes. I don't see that. He doesn't mention Quigley there, but I'm going to, because people can go and get that quote from Quigley's book. Carroll Quigley was President Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University, wrote this book. He was a member. He's dead now. Incredible book. It's huge. I have an original copy here. They're quite valuable. And he wrote this book, wonderful history of the world in the last 100 years, 200 years. Page 1247 and 1248, folks. Don't forget that, because you're going to get this book someday, or maybe it's on the internet. Let's take a look at this quote, 1240. It says, this is the fact that the Republican-Democrat Party are the same at the top, and that's why, when we vote, we never get candidates. And if there is a good candidate, they make sure that he never makes it into the final election. All right, now, it says here, the chief problem of this is page 1247, Carroll Quigley, Clinton's mentor, Tragedy and Hope. Member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He did, Quigley said that he agreed with the goals of world government and all, but he did not think it should be kept a secret from the American people. Chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and international. Hear that? International. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. All right. Now that's what Sutton is talking about. He says, our two-party Republican-Democrat equals one Hegelian party, no one else welcome or allowed system is a reflection of this Hegelianism. A small group, a very small group, by using Hegel, can manipulate and to some extent control society for its own purposes. More than that, reflect on their pirate flag. An emblem found on poison bottles, the symbol of the Nazi Death Head Division in World War II. Not only did Skull and Bones become a major force in drug smuggling, the Bush and Prescott families in the 1860s that I was talking about earlier, Yale in China, but in true Hegelian fashion generated the antithesis, the so-called war on drugs. This hypocritical policy maintains the price of drugs, controls supply, and puts millions in jail, while the gainers, in great part, are none other than the same bonesmen who passed the laws to prohibit Bonesman Taft, 1904. That must have been under President Taft. All right, right and left, a control device. For Hegelians, the state is almighty and seen as the march of God on earth. Indeed, a state religion. Progress in the Hegelian state is through contrived conflict. The clash of opposites makes for progress. If you can control the opposites, you dominate the nature of the outcome. We trace the extraordinary Skull and Bones influence in a major Hegelian conflict, Nazism versus communism. Skull and Bones members were in the dominant decision-making positions. Bush, Harriman, Stimson, Lovett, and so on, all Bonesmen, and instrumental in guiding the conflict through use of right and left. They financed and encouraged the growth of both philosophies and controlled the outcome to a significant extent. This was aided by the reductionist, in quotes, division in science, the opposite of historical wholeness. By dividing science and learning into narrower and narrower segments, it became easier to control the whole through the parts. In education, the Dewey system was initiated and promoted by Skull and Bones members. John Dewey. Dewey, not the one who a lot of people think it's, the library system. I wish it were, huh? Wish we'd never had Dewey too, huh? All right. In education, the Dewey system was initiated and promoted by Skull and Bones members. Dewey was an ardent statist and a believer in the Hegelian idea that the child exists to be trained to serve the state. That is exactly what's being put in right now by the right and the left. I tell people this, I say, look, there is no difference between certainly this band of conservatives we got who are really Trotskyites, right, neoconservatives, the left and the right are the same. The only people opposing this are teachers because, most teachers do go into education to help children. They love children, believe it or not. And they are not happy. And people can say, the unions are screaming and yelling and they're mad at Obama and the CFR and the Heritage Foundation. Excuse me, folks, did you hear what I just said? I said that Obama, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Heritage Foundation, which is the major number one conservative organization in the country with little, what do you want to call it, clones in every state pushing charter schools and school choice. Those three Heritage Foundation is that drafted the North American Free Trade Agreement, by the way, talking about, this is really, Anthony Sutton would have been very interested in what I'm talking about right now. Talking about the dialectic, Talking about both parties are saying, how many of your listeners know that the in quotes, Conservative Heritage Foundation, that all those elderly ladies like myself, we don't wear tennis shoes anymore. We wear those things that don't look like them, But I learned my lesson, send money to the Heritage Foundation. How many know that they drafted the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has robbed Americans of hundreds of thousands of jobs, but, of course, being part of the dialectic, how that is? Didn't that create the problem that the neoconservative Trotskyites and Obama and the Council on Foreign Relations are solving for us now? Soviet Polytech system, where your children will have no upward mobility, under the unelected school board, unelected boards across the country, because once Americans have accepted unelected councils to run one of the largest segments of their economy, education, they're probably going to throw out the whole elective system, representative form of government, and we will end up with a Soviet system. And all the parts have been put in place anyway through regionalism, which is communism. Right now, we're looking at that right now. And that's why this book of Sutton's is so, so important, because he's explaining. I'm glad he's not here to see how it is going in and what he has said, what he has written about. That's why, folks, you've got to realize you don't keep working hard and fighting and explaining to people what's happening, because we may not, you and I, we may not see the end, but our work and Sutton's work certainly did slow things down. I think I said that before in my last interview. I do believe that we were meant to come down in 1976, and that was when Henry Steele Commager wrote the Declaration of Interdependence, and 130 members of Congress voted for that. Traitors, They wanted to bring us down then, and they didn't. And that was when the NEA's cardinal principles were written too, that I mentioned earlier, that had Rockefeller and Bundy all in bed with the educators. That was then too. So our people have really, I would give them at least from, I think the latest that we were meant to come down with these traitors would have been probably 1985, when Reagan signed the agreements with Gorbachev to merge the two education systems. But we didn't go down because they don't let us know we've got victories. We do. We've had victories. And, I mean, when I leaked that document to, I guess I like to leak a lot of things, don't I, I leaked the technology grant in my office, better education skills through technology, to the press. Because that was going to put all the computer software in every area for the computer. It did, into every state in the country. But I thought I'd better leak it to the press, and I did. And what's interesting here is I never knew. I gave them a good job, I got myself fired, But I never really knew whether I had been at all effective until one of our researchers who subscribed to a technology journal, the leading technology journal in the United States, sent me a copy of an article. It didn't mention my name, but it said that someone in the United States Department of Education had leaked a very important technology grant to the press, and that it had held them up 2 years. Well, 2 years is better than no years. So you have to realize that your work out there is extremely important, and we could have gone down a lot earlier, so just keep working. Okay, so in education, the Dewey system was initiated and promoted by Skull and Bones members. Dewey was an ardent statist and a believer in the Hegelian idea that the child exists to be trained to serve the state. This requires suppression of individualist tendencies and a careful spoon-feeding of approved knowledge. That approved knowledge right now is the communist, I call it the communist core. Everybody else calls it the common core. I hate the word common anyway, but it's communist core. And our people don't understand that there's nothing new about this. I just found, it's an article in my book, Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, written by Edith Kermit Roosevelt in 1968. in regard to the use of program learning in one of the inner city schools, in which they had pictures of a torch and a porch. And the child is meant to, fill in the blanks, torch the porch. And this was really, horribly leading the children to believe in, radical activism. Back then in 1968, we wondered, this is very important what I'm saying, I'm glad I remembered this. That particular program, which was program instruction, again, Skinner, was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And our people now who are doing research on Common Core, and I'm glad they are, because finally they're going to realize that Common Core is nothing but Marxism. And they've taken, subjects like English and math and whatever, and it's how these subjects are being taught for a certain purpose, for social change, for the common good. And if people, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator, pedagogy, real communist, he wrote a Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And our people have got to understand that what they're looking at with this curriculum, the communist core, I call it, nothing new. I mean, I just took it back to 1968. Edith Kermit Roosevelt. She was the granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt in her marvelous articles written back then. But there's absolutely nothing new about this. Paulo Freire, Brazilian communist, wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And one of the little education games that they have in elementary school to teach arithmetic is with grenades. So that is really what we're dealing with critical thinking and all these educationese words that people are throwing around with the communist core that Charlotte calls it. They've got to realize that there's nothing new. Just go back to Edith Kermit Roosevelt's article. This is pure Marxism. And this is necessary for school to work as well, because the agenda will be training your children in a certain viewpoint to work in the global economy, because they may be sent all over the world. That could happen. The financing of education is going to change radically, where there will not be school budgets for the local school, for your local school or county. Each child will have an amount of money put on his head. And if he's a genius or something, he might be extremely brilliant, and they want him in Moscow later. Huh? They can put a lot of money on that child's head. He's going to be set out of state. This is all sort of peripheral to what I'm talking about now, but this is what Sutton is talking about, the rights of the individual. Forget it. Only serve the state. And that's what's going in right now with President Obama, Arne Duncan, the neoconservative Trotskyite Heritage Foundation, CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. All right. Okay, this suppresses the individualist tendencies and a careful spoon-feeding of approved knowledge. Now, the only knowledge that's important is, first of all, get rid of all the old knowledge. Get rid of the old history, get rid of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, get rid of all the wonderful, extraordinary endeavors made by Americans throughout history, not only in the field of economics and industry and all, but in writing and literature and music and jazz and all. I mean, look at it. I mean, the contribution made by the black people in music in this country. I lived abroad, and I know that that's one of the greatest contributions that was ever made by the black people in the United States for culture. And often that's what Europeans and foreigners would talk about. Now, we had a great country. We had great culture. And all of this, no, we're not going to talk about it anymore. We're just going to have this satanic music, this rotten education that teaches that our children are nothing but animals to be trained. So that's where we are. I hope people are going to take what I'm saying seriously, because it's very, 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 very serious. So what is to be done? He goes on, he says, he goes into George Bush Jr., a bones man, appointing a Monsanto vice president as director of food and drug stuff. It goes into everything. It goes into the new technology. And then he says, what is to be done? If the voting public was even vaguely aware of this rampant and concealed scenario, it could and possibly would force change. However, this is not a likely possibility. Most people are, in quotes, go-along types with limited personal objectives and a high threshold for official misdeeds. What has taken over a century to establish cannot be changed in a few years. The initial question is education. That's why I have always focused on this thing, even before I knew that Sutton was around. I found out years back when I was on the school board. Doc told it, no right, no wrong, Charlotte. We can put in the values clarification. Okay. To eliminate the Hegelian system that stifles individual initiative and trains children to become mindless zombies serving the state. We need a lot less propaganda for education and a more individual creative search for learning. I always said this, instead of more money for education, we need to allocate a lot less. The existing system of education is little more than a conditioning mechanism. It has little to do with education in the true sense and a lot to do with control of the individual. It is more likely the time, rather than the voting booth, will erode the secret power of this Yale group. Nothing this outrageous can survive forever. On the cover of this book is a really interesting quote. And it says, as long, and first of all, I'm going to tell you who this guy is. F.O. Matheson. This is a quote from F.O. Matheson, S&B 1923, to Donald Ogden Stewart, an old-timer, 1916 Bones, about Marty's upcoming appearance before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Now, what I'm going to point out here is when I was in Camden on the local school board, there was a very, I thought, nice woman that I met. Her name was, I'm not going to give her name, but she was the daughter of this F.O. Matheson that I'm going to talk about. And she and I got to know each other because our fathers had been at Hotchkiss School together. Both went on to Yale and were members of the order as well. But I think it was at Hotchkiss they got to know each other. So my friend, up until a point, until she found out my position on the school board, and she couldn't take it, he couldn't deal with me. We were sort of friendly, and then one evening at a Christmas party, lovely party, she lit into me. I think she lit into me, and she said, your position's on the school board. What are you trying to prove, Charlotte? And on and on. It was so bad that I sort of burst out crying in private, and I went home. I walked home in the snow to my house, and I thought, how can anybody just rip somebody apart like that? Well, okay. The reason I mention this is her father, Matheson. He was Skull and Bones, and he was my father's friend, huh? This is her father, and she was evidently just like her father. So what he said, I'm going to read you. It says, quote, as long as we have somebody from Bones who can bring pressure on the committee, I should think we'll be all right. Now, that is Matheson, 1923 Bones, to Donald Ogden Stewart, 1916 Bones, about Matheson's, Maddie's, upcoming appearance before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. So he himself knew, he was telling Stewart, don't worry about this hearing on Un-American Activities as long as I'm there.
I know you had mentioned your father was in Skull and Bones, and so was your grandfather. I know that he made an interesting comment to you. You guys had an interesting experience a week before he passed.
This was nice. I forgot to mention the personal end of it. In 1984, prior to my dad dying, I went down to New Jersey to take care of my father. My sister would go down. We'd stagger it. And I had been working on Phyllis Schlafly's book, Child Abuse in the Classroom, which actually I had a great deal to do with because I provided the parents and teachers who were testifying with all of the terrible programs out of my office. And we were working on that book, and Phyllis and I were talking about all these various problems with education, death education, all this stuff. And my father, who was dying of cancer, we had put a bedroom in downstairs next to the kitchen for him. mind you, my father, who was at the order at Yale, and he had to listen to these conversations. I mean, Phyllis was calling me, quite often, and I was calling her. And we were talking about world government. We were talking about a lot of things we're talking about today. And one day, my father, at the end, he looked at me and he said, this was after I'd sent the books to Anthony Sutton. Actually, that's an interesting little story. Those books arrived while my father was ill, and I was taking care of all the mail. And so I opened them up, and I was really surprised. When I saw them, I didn't know what they were, and I took them into Dad, and he looked at them, and he said, whoa. He said, that's the first time they ever did that. And I said, oh, yeah. Huh? And then was when I did, I guess I wrote Sutton and said that he might be able to use them, something like that. So anyway, but my dad heard Phyllis and I talking, and he heard all the stuff that's sort of what we're talking about today. And he said to me, Char, I remember he looked at me and he said, I wish I had more time because I would help you. I just never forgot that. And he was a wonderful man, and I don't think he never had anything to do with everything I've been talking about today. He was just the opposite, very strong morals and values, right, wrong, the Constitution. He was mayor of several towns, very generous. He never wanted, if he helped someone out, he never wanted them to pay him back. He was a wonderful sense of humor, a big reader. He did at one time say that if he had it to do all over again, he would not be on Wall Street. He would not be a lawyer on Wall Street. He said, I'd rather be a farmer. So that was my dad. And then my grandfather was another kettle of tea, although I loved him. But, he was a very interesting fellow who came from Pennsylvania, and in the late 1800s, it was a mining area, and the whole family had been in coal mining for years, and somehow Grandpa went to Andover School, and then he went to Yale, and he for some reason, I don't know why Grandpa was picked out to be Skull and Bones, but he was. And from there, he was involved in a lot. He first of all went out to California, a desalinization project in California, the gold out there. And then he was invited to go to South Africa. And he ended up opening up the mines in South Africa, the gold mines. And he knew many of the Fabian socialists out there. And he came back, and my father was born there. His father I was just talking about, born in 1903 there, and he was there until 1914 when World War I broke out, and then they left and came back to the United States. And that was probably, my dad was, 11, I guess, yeah. And then a few years later, he went to Yale, and he was tapped for Skull and Bones. But my grandfather definitely, I do believe, he had a lot of these connections with the names that I've mentioned today. I remember that as a child. So that really is basically it. But the beautiful part of the story, as far as the family is concerned, or as far as I'm concerned, because a lot of the members of the family don't even care what I'm talking about. And that's why I love your audience. They do care. Maybe they're tired by now. But a lot of the family, they just they don't care.
That's interesting that you say that, Charlotte. And honestly, that's a way that it helps bridge you with the listeners, because I myself and many others have that same experience where, I do a lot of research in this. You do, many others do, and I find that every researcher that I talk to about this, like you, I would assume that your family would have read your book and been like, "Oh my God," eyes open. And you have the same problems that we do with our families, where there's just people that refuse to listen and see the truth. It's amazing.
Well, it really is, because my book is a rough one to get through, but it is on the internet now. It's easy to look at. But Samuel, now this is a member of the family. My son Sam has American Deception. He understands this backwards and forwards. That poor child, I had him, it was sort of like child labor, back when he was 10, running around the dining room table collating papers and helping his mom. So he's been on the same wavelength with me, all along. But I'm sorry to have to tell you, nobody in our family, I don't think, has looked at AmericanDeception.com. And Samuel, he's put up 118 or whatever, how many thousands of pages of original documents going back 200-300 years, hand scanned each page. I don't know how he did it. How do you do that? Hand scan, huh? He has done that. And nobody in the family has bothered to go to the website. How do you like that? Well, I'm sorry to have to admit this about my own family, but
I have a huge website and I do a radio show, Charlotte, and I have family members that don't even know I do a radio show, even though I've told them and I've sent them links to the archives to download for free. And I'll be talking to them about something once in a while, and they're like, "You do a radio show?" And I'm like, "Really?"
Oh, Popeye, well, that makes me feel better, but in a way, it's sad. I mean, it's just so sad, because if these members of our family would help out, golly, the country would be in different shape, wouldn't it? I know what you mean, though, because people think that you and I and other activists, we've got everybody on board with that. And certainly we would have our family on board. Even if they didn't agree with us, they'd never admit they weren't, huh? But no. There's something out there. It's a virus. We were talking about it before the show. And it's a virus that begins with S.
Oh, yeah, Satanism.
It sure is. And that's really what I was talking about today. And that's what Anthony Sutton is talking about today, because who but Satan could want to destroy free will and the soul? Who but Satan? The soul is really Satan's enemy. And this method that's going in destroys the soul. No less than C.S. Lewis said it, when he was talking about when training beats education, civilization dies. Well, what's the definition of civilization, people? We don't want it to die. We want our children to be reading books, the old classics, and, Gulliver's Travels and Tom Sawyer and all these wonderful books that were, very amusing and interesting and educational, but also there was always some sort of a moral message there for our children, for character building. There won't be any more of that. It's just computers. They're taking all the books out of the schools now. Maybe your people haven't had that happen yet, but again, they're doing it in the minority schools, because it's the charter schools that are going into the minority areas, taking all their books out, putting the computers in. The computer is Skinner's machine. It's his box. He said it. Programmed learning. Programming your children to believe what's best for the New World Order, what's best for Rockefeller and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Maury Strong and you name, on and on and on. Pearson, all the corporations at the trough to make money off of your children, spin off profits, right? And it's all over the world, and that's what's great with the Internet. Like, this interview is going all over the world. And thank God for you, Popeye, and all your listeners. We're all in the same boat.
I agree.
They'd love to use the lifeboat game on us, wouldn't they? The lifeboat game that they used in schools, the survival games where this is to teach the children the importance of life, huh? You're on a boat, and there's boats sinking, and so the lifeboat only has enough room for 8 people, but there are 15 in the boat. So you got to decide who's going to live and who's going to die. That's the philosophy. And that was taught to our children ever since 1965.
I remember it.
Mm-hmm.
See, for me, it's interesting when, just not only reading your book, but when I talk to you, and we discuss this stuff. A lot of it, I experienced this stuff. A lot of this was being implemented when I was a kid. So I remember firsthand being one of the first generations of kids exposed to this garbage, and we were fighting it, and kids were being labeled problem children and everything else.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've seen this with my own two eyes, what you're talking about, and that's why I think it's the universe sent you on your path, definitely, Charlotte, because regardless of why you went into researching education stuff, it dovetailed right back into Skull and Bones. And that dovetailed in with your own personal experience with your father and your grandfather. And I think it was interesting, that the little anecdote about how you had given your father the newspaper. I think it was the New York Times, and he threw it on the floor.
Oh yeah, I didn't say that today. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because he usually it was sort of sad at the end. He always liked his scotch, and he'd have his cigar, and he'd have his New York Times, right? And it got down to the point where he didn't want the cigar, he didn't want the scotch, and I thought, well, at least he'll want the New York Times. And he threw it on the floor. Yeah, he said that if he had longer, he would help me. He did say that. And of course, he was a wonderful person, and I can't imagine him being involved at any really great degree. His friends were, and I didn't talk a lot about that. I did know them. Actually, people, if they read the Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, there is that chapter in there that I wrote, and that talks all about. I wrote that for the book to give a personal feeling from a family member of what these guys are really all about, and it's quite smooth, and it's not Charlotte going after the jugular, because these were normal, awfully nice people that were my father's friends, the ones that were in his wedding. And growing up, they were always sort of, that's the one thing, they do stick together. And they would meet, and he never went to the retreats up at the lake, but they would meet and have a good time, go out on the boat, and I've got pictures of them. And I knew some of his friends. One was Charles Spofford, very important bonesman. And he's very close to my father, and he became he was interesting. He came out of public school in California. He wasn't from one of the elitist prep schools, Chuck. Public school in California, and then he got into Yale, and he got into the order at Yale. I don't know how. He didn't have any relatives who were part of it, but anyway, when he got out, he became a lawyer at Davis Polk in New York City, and he was very good. And I didn't realize at the time, when I was in the State Department working in Middle Eastern affairs, one day I was going up the elevator, and Chuck was in the elevator. And I just said hi, and he said, hello, Charlotte, how are you? I didn't ask him what he was doing or anything, but I asked Dad. And Dad said, well, he's the attorney for the Suez Canal Company. I thought that was very interesting. And he was terribly important. And Dad once, I think, he had a couple, maybe too much to drink one night. With his cigar, he was at the dining room table. He was in his 60s then, and about to retire. And he was talking about Chuck Spofford, and who was a really good friend of his. But he had just enough, a little extra to drink to say, Char, I tell you a funny story. He said, when Chuck was in World War II, he only rose to being a lieutenant. But when World War II was over, he ended up being number 2 with NATO. And I thought, well, that is quite a promotion, isn't it? And Dad said, he shook his head and he said, I never really understood that. It was sort of interesting that my father wouldn't understand that. And if you check the background on Charles Spofford, he was involved in everything you ever heard of, good and bad. And a very nice man. I really liked him. And I liked Charlie Hillis. And I liked a lot of, I knew them. They were regular people. And I find it so difficult to accept the philosophy that they allowed themselves to be taken down that road. Because on appearance, you would never affiliate them with the Hegelian dialectic or anything on appearance. But when you see the goal of the order, and it's very clearly spelled out, that's it. No conscience. You just do your own thing. No right, no wrong. And that's why with Dad, no right, no wrong. Well, that wasn't the way our family was operating. He was a very religious person, Episcopalian, went to church every Sunday. He was, he was a vestryman. So it's sort of bizarre, the whole mix. I think that Sutton and Chris Milligan have really done their homework. And I have to say that without them, I never would have known any of this stuff. I mean, I knew from being a local school board member and then starting an education thing, falling into that important job in the Department of Education, where all the Marxism comes from. I knew that all this was very wrong, but I must tell you, I had no idea that the order at Yale was involved in this until Anthony Sutton told me. And the only way he found out was through my giving him those books with the names. Isn't it interesting? Here he'd done all his research on USA to the Soviets and the German Nazis. And he'd just given up. He couldn't figure it out. Well, I'd done all my research on education, and I didn't know where it came from, but then the books arrived. But I didn't know, what was really in those books, but for some reason I felt it was important to tell Tony Sutton. And evidently I wrote him a letter, and I asked him if he wanted them. I did have the good sense to do that. But isn't it interesting how things just fell in our hands? Sutton fell in my hands. The books fell in his hands. How come? We both were on the same track looking, like down the rabbit hole.
It's the universe. It has an interesting way of doing things, Charlotte. It really does. It's synchronicity. It's amazing who you meet on your journey. It really is. Very definitely. It really is. Like we were saying, there's some of us that it's like we didn't choose to do this, but we were kind of chosen to do this. Well, it's interesting how we all meet and we all come from different backgrounds. It's kind of funny. Well, yes, and we all, once we get this video done, which we're working on, I have the most important part of it for me is it's an honor roll, and I want everyone I've ever known, even it could be a journalist in New Jersey that I remember writing an article and taking a stand against school to work. Paul Mulshine was his name. In the 80s, he took a stand against George Bush, President Bush's, proposal to train our children for the global workforce. And so, that's the only thing I can remember because I didn't know Paul Mulshine, but I read that article in the Newark Ledger or something in New Jersey, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is wonderful. Someone in the media, pretty well-known writer. So I want him to be on that honor roll. I want these people. I think it's when you've been through it, the mill, you know how much of your life you've put into it. It's not that you didn't want to do it, but you know that you've had to take a stand, and often it could well be you've even lost members of your family. I have some friends who were, great education researchers who ended up getting divorced because it just ripped the family apart, the activism, the mom. So I know that there's been so much sacrifice. It's horrible. It's just horrible. And if there's ever, history is ever written again, because I don't know how it will be when this whole thing goes down the tubes, but if it ever was written again, people will be shaking their heads. And he said, that's got to be the weirdest civilization that ever existed. Well, of course, it was the same thing, repeat, Rome. Well, we definitely are making change, Charlotte. And I know, like I said earlier, you have had a profound effect on the world. So don't be down, because realistically, every time I post one of our interviews, I get literally, within the first 24 to 48 hours, I'll get 15 to 20 emails 50 to 100 comments, not only on the YouTube archive, but on Unbound Radio's archive, the radio network that I'm on now, and even my older radio network. People would comment however they could, whether it was emailing the station or on my website on Federal Jack or on the YouTube archive of it. They always comment the same thing. We love her. Thank you so much, Charlotte. You are awesome.
Well,
you've changed my life. People around the world, I mean, I'm talking not 100, no, I'm not talking 200, I'm talking tens of thousands, if not even more, that you've reached and touched, Charlotte. That's amazing.
Boy, is that ever... I'll tell you, that's nice to know. You just made my whole life worth it. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you are an amazing lady, and I'm I'm honored to be able to interview you whenever I can, and just chat with you. It's always a pleasure to sit down with you and pick your brain, and you have a very eloquent way of bringing across some very horrific information to everybody, and I think that's one of the things that resonates with people, Char. I always say this. I say it's like sitting down with my grandma, talking about the New World Order, and you make me want to drink milk and eat cookies while talking to you.
Oh, I love that. Gosh, it's lucky I haven't been drinking milk and eating cookies, or it's been 2 hours of that, Oh, my goodness. But that, well, it is sort of like talking to your grandma. And, I just wish that I had older people, to tell me earlier on that all of this was going to happen. It took, I honestly didn't. Oh, my husband, he passed away 5 years ago. And, he just used to laugh at me how it took me so long to figure out what was going on in the world, because he knew. You see, he'd been educated in Europe, and he knew about all these secret societies. So when I started finding out, he said, Gary Allen's book, Non-Derek Hall Conspiracy, I was like, what? What is this about Wall Street? Because, you see, I had that background with my father in Wall Street and all his friends, Gary Allen. And I couldn't believe it. I said, do you know about this? To my Belgian husband, educated, highly educated, like only in Europe back then. He says, of course I do. I said, you don't know about that? I said, you know what? You never told me about that. He said, well, I thought you knew. I said, no, honey, I did not know. So Gary Allen, of course, is one of the Non-Derek Hall Conspiracy. That's also on my son's website. Good. You can go buy, it's very hard to get that book. That's there. Non-Derek Hall Conspiracy. So I was a slow learner. I had to be in my early 40s, folks, when I first read that book. So don't worry about age somehow. Sometimes, how can you imagine traveling around the world, living around the world? I had a problem with communism. I sure did, always did. But I didn't know what we've been talking about today. I had no idea. I had to find out from Gary Allen that Wall Street was very involved. That was my first learning experience. And all those names of people that I knew in New York City when I was sort of a butterfly. Oh, my, yes, I was a little butterfly. The butterfly sure turned into an American eagle. Yeah, I have them out on the river here, the American eagles. The butterfly turned into an American eagle.
With very sharp claws.
I see them all the time. You should come visit me. Gorgeous, these bald eagles that I have up here. Very nice. It's funny that I should live on the river where there are bald eagles. Wait until you hear this. This is a good one. I've got the Skull and Bones clock, and it has these three things at the top. You've seen them, right? And originally they had three brass balls that went on each thing, right? And one of them broke. So I went to the clock company, the clock place, very good, down in Freeport, and I said, look, can you fix this for me? And then he said, well, gee, Charlie, this is going to take me a long time. This is really a lot of, welding and blah, blah, blah. And he said, but I've got 3 eagles. And I said, you've got 3 eagles? He said, yeah, I've got 3 eagles. They'd fit on there fine. So I took them, and I've got 3 eagles on the Skull and Bones clock.
That's got to be the coolest thing in the world. Not only do you have a Skull and Bones clock, but you have a customized Skull and Bones clock.
It's 3 eagles instead of the balls. Isn't that funny? I never told anybody that before. I think that's very funny. Yeah. So anyway, I have abused the clock to a certain extent as far as it being 100% the order. It's got eagles on it instead.
Really quick, throw out your son's website, your website, and the bumper stickers. I want you to plug them.
Oh, yeah, the bumper stickers are terribly important. I wish people would get in touch with me for them. The bumper sticker is gorgeous. I'm looking at one right now. It's huge, and it's very, first-class sticks well. It's black background. It's about 14 inches by 4, and it says, black background, it says, school in white, school choice / charters. And the next line says, will kill, all that's in white, and then in red, private education. And then it has the 2 websites on it. It's really nice. And by the way, my son just thinks you're fantastic, too.
Awesome.
Oh, yeah, he thinks you're great.
Thank you, Charlotte, so much, and thank you for coming on the broadcast again. As always, it's a pleasure.
I love to do it. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The full uninterrupted interview with Charlotte about Skull and Bones. Again, you can purchase some of the books that Charlotte mentioned over at TrineDay.com, TrineDay Publishing. Make sure you purchase the books, ladies and gentlemen, and educate yourself as to what's going on around the world and in reality, because most people have no idea what's going on. And Charlotte and I only were able to get into the tip of the iceberg. Believe me, there is much, much more. Wonderful lady she is. Just a wealth of information. Go to her websites, AmericanDeception.com, DeliberateDumbingDown.com. She's got bumper stickers. Get the bumper stickers. They're a couple bucks, and she sends you a bunch of them. It's about school choice. Check it out. Purchase her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. I think she might have a few left that she still autographs. She found a couple. She had less than 100 that she had found in storage, and she was selling. They were the original hardcover editions that are out of print, and she signs them. So give her a shout, hit her up, order a book. I promise you, you won't be sorry. You'll literally be holding a piece of history in your hands. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. I'll catch you all again Monday night. Till then, remember, the solutions to our problems are an inside job. Look within yourself, and you will find the solutions that you have been looking for. Ladies and gentlemen, I love you all. I'm out of here.